First, fair disclosure. My wife, Joanne Slotnick, is not here this weekend because she's visiting my father in Denver, who turned 93 yesterday, making him a virtual contemporary of Wallace Stegner. My father, Don Trimble, worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for more than 30 years, and he and his fellow government scientists were my model for manhood as I came of age. Younger geologists described my father to me as a latter-day John Wesley Powell. Do you think maybe I was set up to be sympathetic to beyond the 100th meridian? My father-in-law, whom I never met, bore the name of one of Stegner's childhood heroes. Born 11 years before Stegner, in 1898, Joanne's father, Isidore Slotnick, was known throughout his life as Duffy, a nickname he picked up as a young man in Boston, where he lived his entire life. He played a little sandlot baseball, and he somehow was rechristened Duffy after Duffy Lewis, who played for the Salt Lake Bees on his way to the big leagues and the Red Sox, a man who Stegner, as a teenager, admitted to idolizing. More disclosures. I did meet Wallace Stegner. I do love his writing, especially his articulation of our relationship with our home landscape in memoirish historical ponderings. I love Bernard DeVoto's history too, another outlier writer of bold literary narrative who was never fully accepted by the Academy. I also love the work of Richard White and Patty Limerick and Charles Wilkinson and Melody Graulich. I'm a photographer, and if this remote continues to work, it is continuing to work, that's good. I'm a little nervous about it. I'm a photographer, and I think we need to see more of Stegner's places during this conference, his Mormon country and American places and back roads and rivers and wilderness. So I'm going to show you some of my pictures while I talk. I also write about the West. I'm a little vague on the definition of postmodernism. I'm fond of a quote from Stan Steiner in his introduction to the New Indians. "What I have written is not a study," he said, "but a book of people full of the truths and lies people tell." In this symposium, those of us who have held forth from the podium have done our best to identify the crucial quotes from Stegner. We weave around the steel beams of the canonical phrases, embellishing them with our favorite overlooked passages in what I had feared might turn out to be competitive quotation. It hasn't. But I have one to add from a Stegner letter that Paige didn't know about, the quote that was up on the screen when you came back from lunch. In 1991, 2 years before his death, Wallace Stegner responded to an invitation that Terry Tempest Williams and I sent to him, asking him to join a gathering of Western writers. He couldn't attend, but he answered our request with a few words of guidance, generated at that well-known, deliberative, four-fingered pace at his typewriter, the little machine that tapped out so many stories, so many phrases that we all carry with us. I had the privilege of receiving these words by return mail and reading them to a room full of writers who shared Stegner's love for the North American landscape, his love for both scenery and civilization. He was speaking to all of us in this room as well, who share that same love. "All I can do," Stegner wrote, "is to wish you all well, to urge you all that the object is not to be native or regional, but to be good, and that the best way to be good is to be true to what you know and have lived." Stegner's words often sound simple, but if you worry them, if you do your best to tease out their meaning, they pull away in long and nuanced threads. They have a sturdiness shaded with subtlety. I like their boldness, and I'm moved by their meaning. I've been spending a lot of time this year reading Stegner, looking for leads on Stegner, writing about Stegner. Indeed, I'm spending so much time immersed in Stegner and bringing interesting new anecdotes and realizations to the dinner table, at least they're interesting to me, that my wife tells me that it feels like Uncle Wally has moved into the back bedroom. Not every one of my Stegner realizations is flattering. Just as Patty Limerick reported that she didn't really like Lyman Ward, I admit I grow tired of Susan Burling Ward. I'm exasperated that Stegner didn't include that easy, more specific acknowledgement of Mary Halleck Foote that Melody talked about that would have fended off the plagiarism attacks that have diminished his standing for some. I've signed up for a daily alert sent to me by Google, with every mention of Stegner on the web duly noted. He is everywhere, including an appearance as a clue in a New York Times crossword puzzle. That's one answer I could fill in with confidence, even using a pen. The rest of the world is catching up to my enthusiasms, nowhere more conspicuously than in the outpouring sparked by Tim Egan's column in the New York Times on Stegner's birthday 2.5 weeks ago. Phil Fradkin mentioned this yesterday, and I'll chime in. The 313 comments on Egan's piece range from expressions of love for Stegner's work to scholarly appraisals. The printout runs 65 pages. I'm especially intrigued because I've been listening in on a Stegner conversation closer to home. As a Stegner Fellow at the Tanner Humanities Center, with the support of Tanner Center Director Bob Goldberg, I've taken on the project of creating a statewide dialogue about Stegner's work. I'm taking Stegner's writing on the road across Utah and with the logistical help from the Utah Humanities Council. Here in Salt Lake City, I've brought The Gathering of Zion and Stegner's tribute to Mormon trees from Mormon country to the sons of the Utah pioneers. A wife of one of those sons came up to me afterward and latched onto my hands. She told me how much she loved those Lombardy poplars in her childhood backyard, how 60 years ago she climbed into them as her secret place of solitude. She misses the refuge of those Mormon trees. At the University of Utah, I've been speaking to classes that span the breadth of Stegner's interests. You can pretty much throw a dart at the course catalog and hit a class that overlaps Wallace Stegner's life work. In Delta, I read a passage from One Nation in which Stegner writes of the World War II Japanese-American concentration camps in a book published in 1945 while good American citizens were still imprisoned and living in those camps. And in our discussion at Delta, of course, we talked with the neighboring internment camp at Topaz. And the good people of Delta told me that they were indeed scared of those Japanese Americans when they first moved into the camp a few months after Pearl Harbor. But once they learned that they were people and they came into town for ball games and began working on farms, that attitude changed, especially after the young men in that camp began volunteering for the war. It got complicated after the war when they tried to refigure and reconfigure the land tenure of the camp and reclaim some of their land. Ironic after the loss of land by those Japanese Americans back on the California coast. I read from Beyond the 100th Meridian in Kanab and Springdale and St. George. A Kanab rancher challenged me to take care not to overstate. Oh, it wasn't advancing. There's Topaz. That was supposed to be up while I talked about Topaz. A Kanab rancher challenged me to take care not to overstate Stegner's stance as an environmentalist. Stegner did acknowledge ranchers. Just 3 paragraphs up from the Geography of Hope in the Wilderness Letter, we find this line: I have known enough range cattle to recognize them as wild animals, and the people who herd them have, in the wilderness context, the dignity of rareness. In St. George, I talked the audience through Stegner's life and career, and then came a question that brought me up short from a middle-aged woman in the audience who told me how much she loved her favorite trail in the Wasatch Range at the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon. Her family called this well-worn path Granny's Trail. She went on, I can never be out in nature without thinking about who created it. You went on and on about the connection Stegner makes to nature, but you left something out, the Almighty. Are you an atheist? I have to admit that I've never been asked this before by anyone in my audiences. I answered as best I could, but I'm not religious in the sense this woman was looking for. What about Stegner? Here's what he told us. He wrote, in all honesty, what I believe is neither inspirational nor evangelical. Passionate faith I'm suspicious of because it hangs witches and burns heretics. And generally I'm more in sympathy with the witches and heretics than with the sectarians who hang and burn them. Stegner reveled in the language of the Bible as a foundational text of Western literature, but he found his solace in the here and now, in the threads of history, in the reassuring universals, what he called the great community of recorded human experience. Stegner felt a warm welcome in Salt Lake's Mormon ward houses as a boy, and though he never considered conversion, I believe his friends in the LDS Church shaped his belief in community and cooperation. My year as a Stegner Fellow coincided with the election of Barack Obama, and I couldn't help but notice that Stegner shared a suite of values with our new president, a stunning combination of civic engagement and citizenship, of scholarship and thoughtfulness, and a fondness for the word responsibility. In his This I Believe essay, written for the original This I Believe series, created by Ed Murrow in the 50s, Stegner talks not of God, but of citizenship. He wrote, "I do not see how we can evade the obligation to take full responsibility for what we individually do. I believe in conscience. In the essential outlines of what constitutes human decency, we vary amazingly little. The Chinese and Indian know as well as I do what kindness is, what generosity is, what fortitude is. They can define justice quite as accurately. It is only when they and I are blinded by tribal and denominational narrowness that we insist upon our differences and can recognize goodness only in the robes of our own crowd." Was Wallace Stegner an atheist? Am I an atheist? The word leads us down a sidetrack. Stegner was, to his core, a humanist. As he put it, "About God, I simply do not know. I don't think I can know." These Stegner-based conversations in the far corners of Utah continue to surprise me, and I'm only halfway through my journey. As I look for excerpts in Stegner's life work, pretty soon the whole state is alive and illuminated by his words. One example from American Places. Stegner retells the visit of his aunt, fresh from Iowa, to southern Utah. She couldn't get a sense of the scale of the high plateaus, which loom without asserting themselves, as Stegner puts it. She looked at the 5,600-foot western face of the Sevier Plateau rearing above Richfield, and she said that she was reminded of the bluffs in the county park in Fort Dodge. Stegner, shaped by the West, smiled. "Nothing now reminds me of Fort Dodge. This is country where I spent the summers of my adolescence, and what I see is enriched by geology, history, and memory. What we see is enriched by Stegner." I make a request at each reading, and I'll make the same request here. If anything in Stegner's work or in my talk triggers a memory or idea of your own, I'd love to hear from you. Are you too hoping that we can create a society to match our scenery? Do you still believe in the geography of hope? Do you mourn or celebrate changes in your favorite landscape? I'll be happy to receive your responses in any form, any media. You can follow this give and take on my blog at stegner100.com. What I have tried to do locally, Tim Egan's centennial commentary in the Times, and the power of the internet have done more broadly, sparked a national conversation about Stegner. In his column, Egan focused on what he called Stegner's complaint, the inadequate attention paid to Stegner by the East Coast elite. And then in the comments that follow, we plunge into irony with this amazing discussion of Stegner, both critical and laudatory, right there in the Gray Lady herself, a parade of statements about the man and his work generated by a World Wide Web-based readership. Wallace Stegner would be amused by that irony, flabbergasted by the technology, and gratified by the tributes. I come to these conversations with a relationship with Stegner that began many years ago simply as a reader of his books. I have mined ideas from his writing and depended on his sensibilities. When I photograph, I strive to let his realism, Stegner's articulation of the multi-layered and unfiltered West, direct my eye. When I grappled with the fate of beloved places in my new book, Bargaining for Eden, Stegner reminded me of the complexities of our struggles. A quote from his Wolf Willow became the epigraph for my last chapter. Anyone who has lived on a frontier knows the inescapable ambivalence of the old-fashioned American conscience, for he has first renewed himself in Eden and then set about converting it into the lamentable modern world. This was a theme to which Stegner kept returning. Near the end of his life, he made a quick list in longhand to guide a filmmaker working on a Stegner documentary. Under the heading, What I Learned, Stegner wrote in reference to the West, "Respect for the land and its history, contrition for my part in spoiling it, some sense of responsibility as a citizen at last of the whole country for trying to repair and preserve. Citizen, that word is key. Stegner is the model citizen writer, more than a novelist living in isolation in a literary world, or an outraged environmentalist ranting from the sidelines of society. He is a fully engaged citizen, sensitive to the lives and tragedies of his neighbors, rooted in place and community. My relationship with Stegner deepened whenever I have moved anywhere in the West, because he has been there before me. As a fresh immigrant looking to become a good, engaged local citizen, there always seems to be a book on the Stegner bookshelf to explain how to live without ignorance in these new homelands, to bring the land to life. Fresh out of college in the early 1970s, I left Colorado to work as a park ranger at Arches and Capitol Reef National Parks here in Utah. I quickly found my way to beyond the 100th meridian, and I do feel the same way Bruce Babbitt did when he compared his first reading of that book to having a rock thrown through the window pane of his awareness, leaving him standing wide-eyed among the shards of old ideas scattered at his feet. The book interpreted the land and its history. The book gave me stories to carry along with me, stories of the past. Stegner learned to write history from his mentor, Bernard DeVoto, and that meant living up to DeVoto's insistence that a writer know the scene, visit the places where history happened, place characters in context on the great American continent. Before Stegner wrote of the Colorado River, he floated it himself. Before he ventured to describe the land explored by Powell and his cohorts, he traveled the canyons himself. These backcountry experiences color and layer his words. He isn't so much trying to write history as to articulate the backstory to his own and our arrival in new and challenging country. It's that search for identity Lynn talked about It's that search for identity Lynn talked about this morning as his great theme. His explorations began in his Salt Lake City youth in the 1920s. Those childhood trips to Fish Lake and the high plateaus led directly to his PhD dissertation on Clarence Dutton, the pioneer geologist whose gorgeous prose still forms a touchstone. Stegner's explorations of the canyon country with his Boy Scout troop led directly to his interest in John Wesley Powell. The land led to his books, just as the land led Bruce Babbitt to geology. And the research for Stegner's books educated him and radicalized him and led to his stance as an activist. As for me, I kept moving. After each move, I searched for the relevant Stegner book to guide me into the heart of the place. I spent a summer in North Dakota, and to understand the northern plains, I read Wolf Willow, stories from Stegner's earliest childhood on the Saskatchewan frontier. And no one else has pointed out that the Stegner home in East End is now a writer's retreat. And so if any of you are looking for a nice quiet place to ponder your memoir or novel, for $250 a month, you can live in the Stegner home and look out at sunset over the Cypress Hills and figure out what your next word is going to be. My book projects took me to the Great Basin Desert next. Stegner's essay, The Land Nobody Wanted in Mormon Country, was my introduction to this ocean of sagebrush and pickleweed. I trusted his definition of the essence of the place in all its flamboyant and bizarre beauty. When I moved to Salt Lake City, the first book I read was Stegner's Recapitulation. In Bruce Mason's memories lies Stegner's affection for this place. Recapitulation concludes in the Salt Lake Cemetery, where Bruce Mason buries the last survivor of his family, just as Stegner buried his mother, father, and brother there before he was 30. Bruce Mason looks across this sweep of green space perched on the terrace of our urban valley, watching the storms whirl through, just as Stegner did, and just as I do, for I've lived 3 blocks from those graves for 20 years. The graves are still there. Brother Cecil, who died shortly after he married, leaving behind both wife and child. Mother, Hilda, gone from cancer just 2 years later. And finally, the father, George, too, though Stegner chose never to place a marker over his father. Bob Kiter and I took our students to the cemetery on the first day of our Stegner class, and we read that last scene aloud as we sat on the grass of the Stegner family plot. One of the students said feelingly that it would have been lovely if Stegner had gone ahead and placed that stone, as his character Bruce Mason chose to do at the end of Recapitulation. I know of one Stegner devotee who is contemplating finishing the task himself and paying for a grave marker for George Stegner. I have to admit, I think it's a bad idea. Wallace Stegner was able to write that gravestone into fictional reality, but not his own. I think that's the way that we need to leave things. Wallace and Mary and Paige made their home in the California Coast Ranges. They summered in Vermont. But when Stegner felt the need to select a hometown, and he sifted through those many places that he had lived, to his surprise, he chose Salt Lake City. In the essay, At Home in the Fields of the Lord, Stegner keeps circling with some wonderment around his choice, playing his own devil's advocate, examining the heart of this odd and lovely place. He finds that what made Salt Lake City home was living there with complete participation. In his concluding words, home is what you can take away with you. When we live with complete participation, we become part of a place. The more we know about that place, the deeper our participation. The place becomes home. We sense a similar connection if we wander in wild country for an hour's hike or a week's camping, hunting, or river trip, accumulating memories that have an intensity to which writers pay special attention. In 1975, my relationship with Stegner moved from books to experience. When I was a young ranger working behind the desk at the Capitol Reef National Park Visitor Center, Stegner kept appearing at the edges of my life, and I savored every encounter. Bates Wilson, the much-loved founding superintendent of Canyonlands National Park, walked in one day with his trademark Will Rogers grin, striding into the dim exhibit space from the sun-struck Midsummer Canyon outside. He proudly told me stories of how he and Wally, working as advisors to Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, had managed to help establish Canyonlands, upgrade arches to a national park, and to enlarge Capitol Reef and boost it from the little national monument surrounding the village of Fruita to a full-blown national park about 10 years before. Bates clearly wanted any ranger working that desk to know this story. Within a couple of years, I had reason to write to Wallace Stegner, asking for permission to use his words on oversized postcards, pairing my photographs with the likes of Stegner, Dutton, Muir, Abbey. His responses were warm, immediate, and encouraging. He recalled working to upgrade Capitol Reef to national park status, but he cautioned me, "Don't tell any of the local ranchers, or they'll send me letter bombs." He wrote to ask for leads on local people when he came to Fruita, to renew his boyhood memories of the little oasis in the Slick Rock for the bicentennial book American Places, just to see how the present has intruded on their serene isolation. He signed off as Wally. I now realize that when I wrote to Stegner from Capitol Reef, I had already won him over. He and Mary made a point of returning to this favorite place. When Stegner wrote of the consummation of his first great love in recapitulation, he set the courtship scene in the orchards of Fruita by moonlight. When he got my note from Capitol Reef, I didn't know that we were already members of a small band of devotees of this obscure refuge tucked away in the Red Rock wilderness. Though he didn't know me from Adam, my return address warmed his heart. I first saw Wallace Stegner in the flesh when I returned to graduate school at the University of Arizona. I had felt compelled to study ecology to give my natural history writing some academic depth, but I soon felt out of my element in all that theoretical science. When Stegner came to campus in 1977 to read from recapitulation as a work in progress and to submit graciously to interviews by English grad students, conversations recorded in Jim Hepworth's book, Stealing Glances, I spent as much time as I could hovering around the edges, listening. It was a release and a relief from my immersion in evolutionary theory. In person, Wally Stegner was just as kind and straight and clear-eyed as he had been in his letters. Soon afterward, I broke free from the constraints of pure science and spent a couple of years editing Plateau magazine for the Museum of Northern Arizona. Wally consented to write an introduction for an issue about water on the Colorado Plateau. He dashed off the piece quickly. This was hardly high priority work, and he gave me, at about 28 or 29 years old, carte blanche to edit it. I remember looking at his typescript lying on my desk in my little office in the Ponderosa Pine Woods at the outskirts of Flagstaff. I shake my head in wonder to think how blithely I reordered his paragraphs. In the mid-90s, I found direct inspiration in Wally's activist stance as Terry Tempest Williams and I worked to create the collection of essays that became Testimony. We aimed to influence congressional policy, and we decided to do so with the passionate words of writers. Stegner's Wilderness Letter was our touchstone. Nudged a bit by the Sierra Club's David Brower to write something about the wilderness idea, Wally agreed to crank out that letter in 1960 to add to the bureaucratic record. When Page talked about his father's correspondence yesterday, I wanted to ask him, did Wally ever rewrite these things, or were these crisp and eloquent missives his first drafts? Seated at his desk in the hills above Palo Alto, Stegner imagined the view across his boyhood haunts in southern Utah, ranging out from the family cabin at Fish Lake. As he wrote his way to the end of the letter, he accelerated into the crystalline paragraphs that closed with his most widely quoted 4 words, the geography of hope. Stegner used the word hope often. He called the West the native home of hope, and then in his last book, he took back his vision. In his 80s, he feared that the native home of hope wasn't going to deliver, that we are incapable of building a society to match this scenery. I think his despair was real, but I also think he meant to challenge us, to throw down the gauntlet, to get to work and to create the home of hope as we grow into this land, as we map our community geography together in Charles Wilkinson's Fourth West. Our success depends on good conversation, on valuing each other in the same way Stegner valued both his friends from Harvard and his friends from Fruita. That's why I think Wally would have been so taken by the comments published in the New York Times last week. The range is astonishing. These notes to the Times start with earnest reports of close brushes with the master. One man shared a dinner with the Stegners when he was a young boy living in Greece, just days after the assassination of JFK. His mother, the ever-cheery hostess, insisted on shifting Wally from his musings on the meaning of the death of the president to less tragic table conversation. And so Wally spoke to the 11-year-old author about deforestation in ancient Greek watersheds. It was his first lesson in environmentalism. Marshall writes, I am sorry to hear that Stegner felt dissed by the East Coast media establishment, but sorrier still that he isn't here to read these gorgeous comments, which are far more of an homage and a belief in his great writing than any critic of a big city newspaper. When I read Stegner, I smell the sweet, sharp scent of sage from the high mountain desert and feel the comforting heat from sun-baked stones from my home state of Utah. No other author has that power for me. From Rob Daly, if you don't crave mountainous solitude, love shades of brown, how could you understand? If you never had a childhood friend who was a Mormon, Native American, or Japanese American, you probably can't relate to the Western experience. Every Western family has a member or two just like Bo Mason. If you think Shasta is a soda, Stanley makes tools, and magpies are made with magberries, why should I expect you to understand or appreciate my experience? Wolf Willow still resonates for Larry decades after reading. Not much else, he said, I read. Not much else I read, he said, 40 or 50 years ago, still is as fresh as this morning. Another reader writes that Stegner's description of the song of the Western meadowlark connected experience with a kind of poetry for the first time. Other fragments, the foundational writer of the American West. I revel in his lyrical grumpiness, his passionate love of the land. Angle of Repose comes up over and over again. Angle of Repose was the most sensitive and sophisticated treatment of displacement, of longing, and the search for home, of the cultural and physical differences between East and West. Angle of Repose taught me how to live my life. Not my life as a Westerner, which I was for many years, but just my life. And another. We wear the titles we have read like Scouts badges proudly emblazoned on our minds and hearts. Angle of Repose is one of those novels, once read, stays ironed on. I'm often asked, another reader writes, who's your favorite author? To which I usually reply, 20th century, Stegner, Updike, Bellow, Coetzee, McEwen, in that order. They're not all gushing love letters. Here are some of those non-gushers. There are few better writers, but many more engaging novelists. There is something hard and unreal about his Western fiction that doesn't ring true. Has anyone else noticed a subtle anti-Semitism that runs through his books? His writing is orotund in the negative sense of the word. Did Stegner do a magnificent job of fostering and retelling the Western myth? Absolutely. But they add, did he complicate that myth? Yes, he did, but not enough. Critique and tribute, the comments just keep building. I find I'm inclined to agree with J.R., who writes, I have little doubt that his bicentennial will also be celebrated. Our relationship with Stegner is fundamentally that of reader with writer, and so timeless. Stegner would see connections that run from this precarious moment as a society, back through culture, to the land itself. He wrote, land gave Americans their freedom. It also gave them their egalitarianism, their democracy, their optimism, their free enterprise capitalism, their greed, and their carelessness. It is an ambiguous and troubling legacy. Our unambiguous connection to land will sustain us. The troubling ambiguity of what we do with that relationship will give us plenty to talk about at that bicentennial exploration of Stegner's work. This is why Stegner matters and will continue to matter. As Lynn Stegner said this morning, he was unalterably and gladly placed. We strive to be placed. His work remains a guide to what Wendell Berry called homecoming on Thursday night, in a body of work filled with yearning, searching, and challenge. Stegner teaches us how to come home. Thank you.
In your wanderings around Utah, did you find that Wally was associated with the environmental movement and that caused some questioning and hostility, or was his view of balance and civilization of matched scenery welcomed and known in the far reaches of the state?
Most of the people who are coming to hear about Wallace Stegner seem to know a little bit about Wallace Stegner. I was challenged by that rancher in Kanab who asked me to remember ranchers and their relationship with land. And I was challenged by a few students who were forced to come and who complained about hearing all this environmentalist rant just one more time. But the people who chose to come, and 70 people came to the library in Kanab to hear about Wallace Stegner, seemed to be pretty receptive. One thing people keep asking me is, did Stegner transfer his allegiance to Vermont? You know, I point out that he left Utah in the 1930s, but as we've heard over and over again, this is the place, the West, that made him. And he wrote about many places, but he loved this place, and he continued to write glorious words about this landscape. Okay, thank you very much.